Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Baseball at Melbourne. Hello there. Well, it's long about that time of year when a young man's fancy turns, and we wake up to listening to the birds in the morning and people with green thumbs starting to poke around in the ground. It's been a long time coming our way, it seems like, but that just makes it so much more interesting. And one of those manifestations of the season, like daffodils and convertibles with their tops down, is young men with baseball mitts throwing the ball around a vacant lot. And as long as spring has been bringing the daffodils to Grace Harbor and calling the birds back, baseball has been here almost as long. For the first athletic event after the famous foot race down Heron Street in 1886, that was won by the immortal Jeff Moorhead, was the baseball game between Hoquiam and Aberdeen on the 4th of July, 1887. It was the first athletic contest between the two settlements on record, and they had to go out of town to play it. But it's worthy of considerable note, and as such, we're going to give it a spot here in our Hometown Scrapbook. But first, a word from Dick Crombie and our sponsors. Ever since Hoquiam and Aberdeen had 9 men in their respective settlements, there have been talk about a baseball game. It probably dated back several years before it was actually played, but all of the threats and promises to organize teams proved nothing until the spring of 1887. By this time, both cities were making headway towards civilization. Aberdeen had a very presentable cluster of stores on Heron Street in the first block west of the river, and Hoquiam was growing in about the same pace, near the river on 8th Street. And when the long 10-hour work days were over, and the men about town gathered at the hangouts along the streets that spring, they talked seriously about baseball. Young men, that is. As spring got into the stretch, and the long evenings provided time for a few innings, there were nightly games on the sawdust-filled roads near Old Emery, Mack, and Wood Mill, which would be about the corner of 1st and East Street today, about where the Red Fin Hall stands on 1st Street. Aberdeen was discovering its potential baseball players, and at the same time Hoquiam was turning up its prospects on the sawdust of diamonds that were roughly laid out not far from where Swanson's Market stands today in Hoquiam. Aberdeen's prospects included such players as Layman Babcock, Cal Maynard, and Billy Pearson, all of them now gone, but all well remembered for their part in Aberdeen's early beginnings. And shortly before the glorious 4th, the team was joined by young J. Weatherwax, who was fresh out of Michigan College and had joined the crew at his father's mill, and the Anderson Middleton as a log sealer. It's a pretty fair team that held its final workouts, and there were considerable speculations of their chances in the contest. Now, this was to be no ordinary 4th of July. It hadn't been so many years since Grace Harbor had enough people to observe a 4th, maybe 3 years. And now that Aberdeen was a town of several hundred, and Hoquiam the same, the villagers were determined to turn out in force to make a do of it. The two cities were located on low ground. They were surrounded by swamps and practically no high ground. Our hills to the north had been cleared, or for that matter, even logged. So the first spot where the two towns had enough room to get together, it was decided, would be Montesano. And just to make it unanimous, Cosmopolis was invited to attend. Scammons Meadow, in what is now called South Montesano, was set for the place, and the whole county was to converge there for a glorious 4th of July. It was on the banks of the Chehalis River. Montesano was then situated down there, And about where the original courthouse stood, the meandering Chehalis has cut itself a channel today. There was no riverboat big enough to take all of the townsfolk, and in fact no combination of riverboats. So 2 big scows were rigged for the trip. On the morning of the 4th, 1 scow came up from Hoquiam, towed by the little river steamer Tilly. The 2nd scow was taken in tow at Aberdeen, and a stop was made to pick up the people of Cosmopolis. The little steamer and its tows, which contained most of the people of the 3 cities, then proceeded upriver to Montesano. Of course, the gathering was the occasion for the biggest scale news and gossip passing of the season, and everyone marveled at how everyone else's children had grown, and how so-and-so put on weight, exchanged recipes, and told of their latest letters from the East. But of course, most of the interest of the day was centered on the baseball game. Now, the day before, Aberdeen's team had been warming up in their sawdust park. The team had only 1 baseball. In fact, there was only 1 baseball in the whole town, and another 1 baseball in Hoquiam. And someone had clouted the lone ball into the willows at the edge of the field, and the team searched for an hour for the ball before they found it. And they had just gotten back into play when Lime Babcock fouled one off of Jay Weatherwax's pitches, and the ball struck catcher Billy Pearson in the eye. It was a day before such essentials as a mask were required. Chest protectors and, in fact, even baseball mitts were not required yet. Pearson caught most of the time bare-handed, and none of the players had equipment. So the foul tip that caught Pearson in the eye and smashed the bridge of his nose was not unusual for the ball game. But it now appeared to be disastrous, for Billy Pearson was the team's only qualified catcher, and old-timers recall him as one of the best in the business back in those old pioneer days. Well, Cal Maynard took Billy over to the boarding house and slapped a chunk of beefsteak over his swollen eye and bashed nose. And for the rest of the evening and all that night, Billy wore that beefsteak, and the team prayed in their separate and individual ways. But the next morning, Billy's eye was closed. Well, as we said, the whole lower harbor moved up the river for the ball game. The Governor Newell brought a boatload up from Westport in addition to Tilly's 2 barge loads, and Montesano added its delegation. For the kids of the county, it was something never to forget. Aberdeen's town band of 7 pieces played Bird on Nellie's Hat and other favorites, and of course, the fanciers of the town circulated through the crowd, taking bets of their own favorite teams to win the game. Ed Finch, Edward C. Finch, to take the more formal approach, was named as stakeholder, and he turned around and bet the stakes on Aberdeen. Some of the pioneers who recall that event reckon that Finch would never have seen the day that he built the 5-story building on Heron Street if that game hadn't come out the way it did. Well, they took to the field, those old-timers, for the first baseball game to be played according to regulation in the history of the county. Legend has it that rural Nims of Cosmopolis was the Empire, as an outsider. But I can't get no verification of that legend, and I regret that I cannot get the name of a single Hoquiam player. The old-timers who saw the game are so few, and the years so many, that those players are lost to the mist of years, unless this story should stir old thoughts and bring out a few of those historic players. But I do have the names of 6 of those Aberdeen players who took the field. Pasture, that is, at Montesano all those years ago on the 4th of July. Billy Pearson, with a swollen nose and closed eye, was the catcher. Jay Weatherwax was a pitcher, and the fielder included Fred Antrim, Cy Stapleford, Lime Babcock, and Cal Maynard. Now, there was another event of note in that game. For the college-trained Jay Weatherwax was the first Grays Harbor pitcher ever to throw a curveball, and for the most of the spectators at the game, it was the first curveball they had ever seen thrown. It baffled the Hoquiam batsmen, who couldn't touch the pitches, So the teams came up to the ninth inning with a score of 42-2. That's right, 42-2 in favor of Aberdeen. Hoquiam, which displayed its never-say-die spirit during the past basketball season, had the same fire and fight back there in 1887, and the team rallied in the ninth inning to push across a dozen runs. That would have won most ball games, but not the one in Montesano. However, it ended the game. According to the records, the score at the end was 42-14. Some of the spectators who had bet on the game protested strenuously about the curveball and claimed that it was not fair. But the Aberdeen players, who had watched their opponents swing futilely in the air at the twisters, felt pretty gay as they went into their final inning, and it almost proved their undoing, for Hoquiam began to hit the curve, and they belted the ball over the lot, piling up a dozen runs in one inning. Fred Atram was finally called in to relieve Ben Weatherwax at the finish of the game. According to legend, because no one remembers it very clearly anymore, the actual score of the game was estimated. Both sides had lost counts of their runs, and the official scorekeeper had given up about the middle of the game in the belief that Aberdeen was going to win without opposition. So the game rumbled to an argument conclusion, with Hoquiam having a justified claim to more runs. One old-timer says they gave it to Aberdeen because it was figured that Aberdeen players had more time at bat. Anyhow, the game went down in history as the first of a good many contests between teams representing the opposite sides of Myrtle Street. Oh yes, and Billy Pearson, with his one eye and bashed face, he caught the entire game with only a baseball mitt in Aberdeen stuffed full of rags, and didn't have a passed ball or an error. Such old times as late Joe Graham recalls him as the greatest catcher he had ever seen in action, and among the old-timers, he enjoyed the reputation to the end. As a side issue of that baseball game, there was some public speaking. No formal gathering was ever complete without speeches. On this occasion, George Emerson, the Hoquiam industrialist leader, climbed onto a fir stump after the lunch baskets had been emptied and delivered a patriotic address on the glorious 4th. It was along towards sundown when the little steamer Tilly splashed up at the dock at Cosmopolis, towing the two barges, and began to unload the passengers after what, up to that time, was the most important day in the memory of Grays Harbor residents. And it was an hour later before the last barge was docked at the old Northwestern Mill in Hoquiam, and the day ended for Grays Harbor residents. Yes, it's another spring, a good many years after that one that brought baseball to Grays Harbor and was climaxed with a ball game in the grand and glorious 4th. But we'll reserve comments on the spring for a future event when we find ourselves closely akin and reading once again from the pages of our hometown scrapbook. Thank you for listening.